Hello everyone, welcome back. I hope all of you read chapter 4's PowerPoint slides or you watched my recorded video. So in chapter 4 we discussed about activity-based costing. As I mentioned in my very first class that the cost structure of a manufacturing company is really complicated because they deal with three types of inventories. And if we need to calculate the manufacturing cost of a product, we must need to calculate three types of costs: direct material cost, direct labor cost, and manufacturing overhead cost. Direct material and direct labor costs, these are direct costs, these are easily traceable, and you can calculate this cost very precisely. But on the other hand, it is complicated to calculate the manufacturing overhead cost. So in chapter 3, we learn how we can apply one plant-wide or company-wide predetermined overhead rate to measure our allocated overhead costs. So this is the formula that we have used in chapter 3. To calculate our allocated manufacturing overhead cost, first we need to use this formula and we have to determine our overhead rate. So the formula is total estimated manufacturing overhead costs divided by total estimated amount of allocation base. And once you know the rate, then for a certain type of job, you need to check what is their actual allocation base. Then you can multiply this rate by the actual amount of allocation base. And that will give you an assigned or allocated manufacturing overhead cost. But in chapter 3, we actually use one overhead rate. And that rate is actually plant-wide or the company-wide. But you know, we can look into the overhead cost very precisely, and we can also measure the overhead cost based on different type of activities. And that's the main theme in chapter 4. So now we are practicing one problem, E420A. In this problem, Fuller Company uses ABC or activity-based costing. So for this type of costing process, companies first identify all those relevant activities and then they actually estimate their total amount of overhead cost for every activity, and they also figure out what are the allocation bases. So, for example, in this problem, the company actually identified 4 manufacturing activities. These are material handling, machine setup, insertion of parts, and finishing. And for every activity, they have their total estimated or budgeted costs. And you also know the allocation base or cost driver for every activity. Now, the company will also estimate their allocation base. So here in this problem, the company expects to produce 1,000 chrome wheel, and they are expecting to use all these allocation base. These are 3,000 parts, 10 setups, and they're gonna consume 2,000 hours of finishing time. So now what we will do? We will calculate this predetermined overhead rate for every activity. So the concept is same, but we will have 4 different rates for 4 activities. And then we will calculate our overhead costs for these 2 types of jobs using those activity-based rates and then using those actual amount of allocation base for every activity. So first, let's try to calculate those predetermined overhead rate for every activity. Today I'm using my own computer, and you will let me know about the video quality and whether you prefer the classroom recorded lecture or this type of computer recorded lecture. but I would really request you to solve the problem with me. So let's do E4 20A. The name of the company is Fuller Company, and now we are computing the cost allocation rates, and we will be computing the cost allocation rates for every activity. So let's try to make some columns. First, we will write down those activities. Then we will list our total estimated costs, and then we will divide it by our estimated allocation amount, and this is how we will figure out our activity-based cost allocation rate. Okay, so let's try to do our first activity. Our first activity is material handling. And for this activity, our total estimated cost is $12,000. So for every problem, you will be given this type of nice table. You will figure out all those overhead costs for every activity, and you will check what are their allocation bases and what's their estimated allocation base. I mean the total amount of estimated allocation base. So for material handling, their total estimated overhead cost is $12,000, and their estimated allocation base is, first let's check what is the allocation base. This is number of parts, and the company estimated that they're gonna use 3,000 parts. So material handling cost is driven by the number of parts, and they estimated they are going to use 3,000 parts. That means their estimated allocation base is 3,000 parts. So now if we follow this formula, this is our total estimated overhead cost. We are dividing by our total estimated amount of allocation base, which will actually give you the rate. So if you divide this $12,000 by 3,000, then you will find that the machine handling cost rate is $4 per part. Now let's do the same thing for our next activity. So the next activity is machine setup, and we estimated our machine setup cost is $3,400. And we also figure it out that the allocation base is number of setup. So let's check what is our total amount of allocation base. It's actually 10 setup. So this is our total estimated cost, and we're gonna divide it by our total amount of estimated allocation base, which is 10 setups, and this is how we will get our machine setup cost rate. So if you divide 3,400 by 10, you will get the rate is $340 per setup. Remember, the cost driver or allocation base is setup. Now our next activity is insertion of parts. So now insertion, let's call it insertion activity. So now we will check what is our estimated cost, and from this table we found that the insertion cost is $48,000, and the cost driver or allocation base is number of parts, we can use the same base for different activities because we used number of parts for material handling too. So we're gonna use the same base. So let's check what was our total estimated parts, which was 3,000 parts. So this is our total estimated cost for insertion, and we're gonna divide it by 3,000 parts, and this will give you your cost rate for insertion. That means 48,000 divided by 3,000. I hope all of you have your calculator with you, so please don't just copy from me. Let's try to calculate it. So use your calculator and check what is the rate, and if you do so, you will find that the insertion cost rate is $16 per part. Our final activity is finishing, and if you check what is the total amount of estimated overhead cost for finishing, it's $80,000. So this is our total amount of estimated overhead cost. We're gonna divide it by our cost driver or allocation base. So finishing costs allocation base is direct labor hours. So let's check what is their total estimated direct labor hours. So it is mentioned here that they are expecting to consume 2,000 hours of finishing time. That means our estimated amount of hours, which is 2,000. So we're gonna divide it by 2,000 hours. So again, let's try to calculate it. $80,000 divided by 2,000, which will give you the rate, which is $40 per hour. So this is how you just calculated your overhead cost rate for every activity. Now what we will be doing, we will calculate our allocated overhead costs for two jobs. First job is job number 420, and these are the actual amount of allocation base, and the second job is job number 510. So we're gonna use these rates, and for every job we will use their specific actual allocation base, which will give you your total amount of assigned costs. I'm trying to highlighting the headings so that you can figure it out easily, what are the headings and what are the information that I took from the problem from your textbook. Okay, so these are our column headings. So now let's try to calculate the cost for our first job. So job 420. Right, let's try to do job 420. So now for job 420, we will check that what are the rates for these four types of activities. We just calculated these four types of activities. Now we're gonna check what are the actual amount of this allocation base. So we will multiply these rates with those corresponding actual allocation base. So for job 421, they actually used 200 parts, and you see material handling's allocation base is $4, base is number of parts, and the rate is $4. That means if they use one part, the cost will be $4. For job 420, they used 200 parts. So what will be your material handling cost? So the material handling cost will be the rate, which is $4 per part, multiplied by the actual amount of allocation base, which is 200 parts that they have used for job 420. So I'm gonna multiply it by 200 parts. So this part is our material handling costs. Now we will do the same thing for our next activity, which is machine setup cost. So the rate is that $340 per setup. Now let's take a look how many setup it requires to do job 420. So they actually required 2 setups. Per setup cost is $340. So you know what will be their total machine setup cost. $340 multiplied by 2. So now we are adding their machine setup cost, and the rate is $340 per setup, and we will multiply their actual number of setup. For job 420 they had 2 setups. Right, this is how we got our machine setup costs. Now let's try to do the third cost, which is our insertion cost. The rate is $16 and the insertion cost is driven by the number of parts. And we already know job 420 used 200 parts. So you're gonna multiply it by 200 parts. Now for our final activity, let's try to take it to the next line so that I can fit all those items in one line. So our final activity is finishing. So for finishing, our rate is $40 per hour, and we used 130 hours for this job 420. Right, so let's multiply this $40 by 130 hours. Oops, I couldn't fit it in one line, but that's totally fine. So if you multiply this first part, which is our material handling cost, $4 times 200, you will get $800. Then let's check what is our machine setup cost. $340 times 2 setups. So 340 times 2. Please check it. 340 times 2, it will give you $680. And then our third activity is insertion. The rate is $16, which is the activity is driven by number of parts. So they use 200 parts for this job. So if you multiply $16 by 200, you will get 3,200. Our final activity is finishing. The rate is $40 per hour, and they used 130 hour. So if you multiply 40 times 130, you will get 5,200. And if you add all this, please check. Let me add all these numbers and let's see how much I got. Here we have $800, 680, 3,200, 5,200. So I got their total as allocated overhead cost for job 420 is 9,880. So that's my answer. You can also check it. What is your answer? So I'm highlighting it. This is the cost for job 420. Now we're gonna do the same thing for the other job. So our next job is job number 510. So let's try to do the same thing, job number 510, and we have all the same rates. But you know, for job 510 they have different amount of allocation base, so we're gonna use the same rates but different allocation base, and this is how we will calculate their assigned overhead costs. So the rates are same, activity based rates are same. For material handling, the rate is $4. And can you check for material handling what is the allocation base? It's parts, right? So it's $4 per part. Now please check how many parts job 520 actually used. So let's go back to the problem. Job 520 actually used 425 parts. So I'm multiplying this with 425 parts. This is how you will get your material handling cost. For machine setup cost, the rate is same. We actually did it here, $340 per setup, and you will multiply how many setups actually they did for job 510. They did 4 setup, so let's multiply it by 4 setups. Now our next activity is insertion. The rate is $16 per part. So we will write the rate first, and then we're gonna multiply how many parts actually job 510 used. So job 510 actually used 425 parts. And our last activity is finishing. The rate is $40 and it is driven by hour, so we're gonna multiply it by the actual number of hours. So job 510 actually consumed 350 hours. So now I will multiply this $40 by 350 hours. Please do the calculation and check the numbers. So I also have my calculator. I'm doing the calculations. $4 times 425 parts. I got $1,700 for our material handling costs, and for our second cost, machine setup costs, 4 times 340, I got $1,360. And then if you calculate this, $14 times 425, I got 6,800. Now our final task, this is $40 times 350 hours, and I got here $14,000. And if you add those, let me check it one more time, 1,700 plus 1,360 plus 6,800 plus 14,000, and I got for job 510 their total allocated overhead cost is 23,860. Please use your calculator and calculate it. So this is how you can use ABC or activity based costing to calculate the manufacturing overhead costs. So we just did all these 3 requirements. Now we will practice another problem, and I will also post this video.